Today we will discuss about the evaluation of training program. Like we have started with the contents of the training program, then we have talked about the different methodologies for conducting the training programs, and now we will talk about when the training program is over, then how to evaluate the training program. So, evaluation of training is basically a systematic process to analyze if training programs and initiatives are effective and efficient. So, whenever we talk about the output, and the output should not be only in terms of the quantity, but it should be in terms of the quality also, and therefore, there is a need for the effective and efficient training program. So, whatever for the purpose we are conducting the training program, then we should be able to come out with the output that our trainees, for the purpose they have joined the training program, they are happy and satisfied. Trainers and human resources professionals use training evaluation to assess specific outcomes. Now, you see that is the training in industries are most of the time conducted on the basis of their demands. So, what is the output? Output is, for suppose it is about that developing the team building. Then when the training program is conducted, when you talked about that is what are the different methods of the team building, that is the forming, storming, norming, performing and adjourning, and then when we talk about when they go back to the workplace and that particular storming phase, whether that storming phase is reduced or not, because whenever we are going from the forming to storming and storming to norming, then in that case if the storming phase is short, immediately the team building will be from forming to norming. Forming, storming will be there little bit, but then norming will be there. So, what is important is that is the after this training program, the employees at when they go there at their workplace, executives when they go there at workplace, they are having the less conflicts, they are understanding each other, they are making the team building amongst themselves. So, this will be in the period of the 1 quarter or the 2 quarters, we will be able to find out that is the now the efficiency is increased of the overall organization of that particular department or section for which the trainees were there, or if there were the complaints have minimized, or when the whatever the discussion is there that is very friendly and very useful. So, if these are the issues or earlier there was problem, people were not communicating with each other, but now they communicate with each other and then they talk and they are having that type of the understanding amongst themselves. So, that the specific outcome or criteria, there is change in output, improvement in output, improvement in productivity. So, that outcomes or criteria are to determine the benefits of the program, and then if it is so, then definitely in that case you will find that is we are meeting our objectives, and in the evaluation of training program then it is becoming successful. It also ensures whether employee training programs are aligned with the company's goals and objectives. Now, I will take the same example of the team building. So, when in team building, when we are talking about the achievements of the goals and objectives, and organization has given the particular objective, that is the yes, conduct the training program, and we want that is our team effectiveness in the organization that has to be improved, and we have to check whether the employee training program are aligned, the training program is as per the need of the organization or not. The training evaluation process assess training effectiveness. So, therefore, if we find certain gap is there, what was the expected, what is the output? If output is good, fine, but output requires certain improvements, then definitely that assessment of training evaluation is very important. It help improve the overall work quality. As I mentioned, that is the suppose trainer comes to know that is the trainees feedback is talking about, that is no, in the training program they will require more contents, then definitely it will improve the quality and boost employee morale and motivation by engaging them in the development of training programs. So, there are many organizations, they are having the in-house training programs, and those in-house training programs, when this type of the evaluation is done, the output is there, then they plan, they design, they understand, and then they try to meet the goals and objectives of the organization through this training program. And once you meet the goals and objectives, it means your efficiency and effectiveness is satisfied, and if it is satisfied, then you can conduct these such training programs again and again. Reasons for evaluating training. Companies are investing the millions of dollars in training programs to help gain a competitive advantage, that we know there is a lot of cost is involved into this particular training program when it is conducted. Companies invest in training because learning creates knowledge. I always talk about the knowledge management. Whenever we talk about the knowledge management, so there are the 7 steps are there. How do you get, how do you use, how do you learn, how do you contribute, how do you build, how do you assess, and how do you divest. So, this is called Wendy-Ruth model. The Wendy-Ruth model of the knowledge management talks about the first and foremost is how do you get. So, therefore, most important is this, what is your source. So, when the trainer is conducting the training program, his source of information is very highly authenticated. It is of the standard of understanding of the trainees. Then in that case, that is, it means that you are getting the right material. When you are using it, a trainer, when he use this study material, he has to see, that is, the contents are very much relevant to the trainees. Suppose he is using the case study, so it should not be the any case study, it should be very much focused to the theme of the training program, and if it is relevant to the theme of the training program, then the trainees will understand very quickly, and then they will go for this particular type of the practices which will be useful at workplace. For example, when we are talking about the training in BHEL suppose, then we take the similar industry like the Alstom, the case study of Alstom. So, we have to use the case study which is relevant, and then how this particular company, X company with the Y company, that is how Alstom has changed its decisions going towards the building these railway coaches, and whether the companies like BHEL, can they go or they cannot go. So, when we are talking about the business diversification, when we are talking about the challenges in the business, and then how to overcome those challenges and find out the solutions, and for this particular concept theme, you are using the relevant case study matching with the industry. So, when you are talking about the manufacturing industries, the case study is to be related to the manufacturing industries. When you are talking about the FMCG sector, FMCG sector. If you are talking about the textile sector, it has to be the textile sector. So, there are hospitality or the hotel industries. So, therefore, in that case, whatever the relevant case study is there, that knowledge is to be used. And when you are using this, the third step, that is the learning. So, then when we talk about the learning, the process of learning, that becomes faster. So, this particular learning is there, then it will start contribution at workplace. When the trainees, when they will learn the relevant knowledge, it is not the general knowledge, it is a very specific knowledge related to their nature of industry, related to their position, related to their work profile, related to their job description. Then in that case, definitely it is about, that is, they will be able to whatever they have get, use, learn, and they will now contribute at the workplace. As soon as they started contributing at the workplace, then they are able to build and sustain. building their positions and sustainability in their position in that particular organization. So, therefore, in that case when they are evaluating, they will see that is whatever they are doing. So, it is the proper evaluation of the sources of the study material is getting the proper, they are using it properly, they are learning it, they are contributing it, they are building and sustain on that, and then they divest this particular knowledge at society, towards the society. So, therefore, when somebody is trained, then he is capable of doing all these issues, that is they are relevant for the purpose of getting their training program more efficient and effective. When research summarizing the results of studies that examine the linkage between training and human resource outcomes, especially many people say that is you cannot teach in 1 week or 1 month or 3 months, that is the how to change your attitude. But here I am happy to share with you the what research says. Research summarizes that the results of studies have examined the linkages, that is the training and human resource output, attitude and motivation. You never know the contents of your training, they may motivate somebody at what time, and therefore, the trainer they have to keep on trying this motivation. They are supposed to have the positive approach, positive attitude, and they have to try to improve on the basis of whatever the stage or level they are. So, it will be a continuous learning. And then creation of human capital. So, when we talk about the knowledge management, that knowledge management that creates the help the talent to develop the human capital. Human capital means here it means that knowledge, skill and attitude. However, we also talk about the knowledge, skill, attitude and habit. So, therefore, in that case that we are talking about, that is how the human capital is to be created. So, it is about the individual level, because first we have to focus, that is the individual goals, but not only to the individual goals, we have to relate the individual goals with the organizational goals. So, then it comes about the organizational performance. So, when individual's performance is enhancing, definitely organization's performance has to be also enhanced. So, organizational outcomes, that is the performance of the organization and productivity. So, whether the training has been properly successful or not, it depends on improvement in the performance of the individual or the organization. And when we talk about the efficiency and effectiveness, and that is nothing but the productivity. So, when we talk about the productivity, so here we will see that is we are talking about how the individual human resource outcome and human resource outcome and the organizational performance outcome, that is how they are increasing about the overall the productivity of the organization. Sometimes we talk about the training programs which are related to be the improving in the financial outcome, and there can be the profit and financial indicators has found that the companies, so individual, organization and then the financial is there. Actually, the financial is also the part of the organization, that companies that conduct training are likely to have more positive human resource outcome. So, naturally the trainees, those who are attending the classes, definitely they will, when they will go back at their workplace, they will be highly motivated, highly performance oriented, and the overall organization performance is increased, and as a result of which the financial outcome will also increase, and greater performance outcomes will be there in at their workplace. Now, to identify the program's strength and weaknesses. This includes determining if the program is meeting the learning objectives and if transfer of training on the job is occurring. Now, the biggest challenge of the training program, and especially the classroom of the job training, there are two types of training, on the job training and off the job training. So, when we are talking about the classroom training, that is the off the job training, and if the job training is there, then definitely we have to see that the knowledge of the trainer that has been transferred. If it is rightly transferred to the trainee, then definitely in that case the outcome will be better. To assess whether the content, that is the study material which we are providing to the participants, organization, that is which are organizing, and administration, those who are supporting of the program, contribute to learning and the use of training content on the job. So, it should be the synchronization, there should be the synergy, there should be the coordination amongst the learning and the use of training content on the job. So, whether it is a content or organization or administration, that all program that should contribute to the learning and use of the training content of the job is there. Third is to identify which trainees benefit most or least from the program. Now, this is also very important. It is not only the training program is evaluated from the point of view of the subject material, or from the point of view of the trainer, from the point of view of trainer-trainee relationship, but it is also important to find out whether the trainees have learned or they have not learned. And if they then in that it means that there should be it will be mutual the evaluation of the trainer also and the trainee also. So, many times many trainers they plan a very small short quiz on the basis of whatever they were taught in the particular period of time of the training. So, whether the trainees have learned or they have not learned, and then in that case that will be seen, that is the how whether the trainees have learned or they have not learned from that particular training program. That can be also the evaluation. So, in the evaluation process it will not be only the content and trainer, but it should be also include the evaluation of trainees. To determine the financial benefits and the cost of the program, this is very important. Whenever we are proposing the training program, then we have to see that is the how we can make the cost benefit analysis, and that I will also discuss separately in my next further module, that is the what is the cost and benefit analysis has to be done. But what is important is that whenever you are making the evaluation of the training program, also please try to find out the measures how to evaluate the training program financially. So, what it was a financial viable or it was not financial viable. To compare the cost and benefits of training versus non-training investments. So, therefore, we have to talk about that is what are the training and there are the non-training cost and benefits are there, such as work redesign, a better employee selection system. So, it is also important. For example, I have discussed in the research methodology, and that is the scales are to be there, and then therefore, there can be the better employee selection system can be used for the purpose of the training program. And here, so it means that there is the you can use those scales at the time of the selection, and then whatever the scales have been developed, and scales can be developed through the training also. And then you can find out that is the yes, then employee selection system that can be more effective. To compare the cost and benefit of different training programs to choose the best program. Now, you see, if you are any organization is announcing the 10 programs in a calendar year, then they have to find out that is the which program is the more cost and benefit is effective as compared to the other training programs. It means that the particular training program that will be more in demand, and as a result of which the ROI will be there. Now, I will talk about the different methods of the evaluation of training program. There are two methods, formative evaluation and the summative evaluation. First, we will go by the formative evaluation. Evaluation of training that takes place during the program design and development is termed as the formative evaluation. It helps to ensure that the training program is well organized and runs smoothly, and trainees learn and are satisfied with the program. And therefore, in that case it becomes very important, that is whatever training program is organized, it should run smoothly and trainees are learning and satisfied with the program. Many times organizations are having the different centers, they are called the HRD centers, human resource development centers, or like IIT Roorkee is having the one Greater Noida extension center, and then there also we conduct the training program for the leadership development program, LEAP programs we are conducting there. Now here we have to find out, that is the because we are conducting at the another center, so HR department should take care that is the all resources are properly managed there. So management of resources and optimization of resources, that has to be organized so that your programs run smoothly, because your trainees are going to a particular place, your employees are going to a particular center, and at that center all comforts for the trainees and trainer also, that has to be organized. But it is the responsibility of the trainer to ensure that whatever the training program he is conducting, and then the trainees, they are into the comfortable positions and they are able to understand, learn, and smoothly the program is conducted. For this purpose, what we can do, we can take the opinions, the people, that is whether it is right or wrong to conduct the training program at that particular center. Then we have to take the beliefs, understand the beliefs also, that is the yes or no, why it is yes or why it is no. Then the feelings of the people, whether they are find emotionally attached there or not at that particular place, and therefore if there is an emotional connect. When the organizers they feel, organization feels, that is the yes, we can conduct this training program at particular place, and there is a emotional connect, then definitely the training program will be more successful. Then there should be the clarity about the program by asking customers. Customers means those who are the different departments, if an organization is their internal customers, those who are the different departments, those who are looking for from the HRD department this particular type of the trainings, are employees, who are the employees are there, managers, that who are the managers who are interested in this particular training program, and what they want, the topic they want. So therefore many organizations they do the survey. Many organizations they find out these topics of the training program on the basis of the performance appraisals, and then they find out that is the yes, if this is the possibility to conduct these training programs on the demand of the employees, what demand they are having about the program, by asking customers, employees, managers, and subject matter experts, that is the sometimes internal experts, sometimes the external experts, and their opinions on the description. That is what we can do, and what is the what type of the support is required, and what type of the training program will be more successful, and what are the expectations of the training, and therefore what are the expectations of the trainer, what are the expectations of the other stakeholders, those who administrators, like those who are organizing this particular training program. So therefore in the formative evaluation we have to involve the opinion, beliefs, feelings, and clarity about the program by asking to whom, to customers, employees, managers, and subject matter experts their opinions on the description. As a result, training content can be made more accurate, easier to understand, or more appealing. So if it is a demand from the trainees itself, that is they want to learn, then definitely in that case it will be becoming more and more efficient and effective training program. However, we have to also see, that is if the duration of the training program is long, the motivation of the trainees, the retention of that motivation level of the trainees, that will be a challenge, and therefore the good trainers, they will make the more participative training programs, as a result of which then we can overcome that particular challenge. It is basically qualitative in nature, and what we understand is, that is whenever we are talking about the quantitative, as I mentioned at the time of the research methodology and the training program also, that is if you are going by the survey, you are taking the giving the scales, taking the responses, they are responding, you are analyzing, but then we have to understand there might be the biasness. To avoid this biasness, you have to go for the common method bias, and then in that case it becomes very important, that is you are going for, that is the subject matter expert's opinion on the description, whether we are going into the right track or not. As a result, training content can be made more accurate. So, therefore, because we are taking from the trainees itself, so their accuracy will be more. To understand, it will be easier for them to understand, because they are coming from the same academic background, they are coming from the same industrial background. So, their understanding level will be more and more appealing also, and they will be more keen to attend this type of programs. So, this particular qualitative nature and the understanding and accuracy and then opinion and beliefs, this all will be creating a formative evaluation of a particular training program. Now, I will talk about the summative evaluation. It refers to an evaluation conducted to determine the extent to which the trainees have changed as a result of participating in the training program, and therefore, that is the how we during the evaluation process is the trainee, they have made the changes in find the change in their behavior, in their approach, in their thought process, in their action. So, therefore, it becomes very important, that is the at what extent they find, even they are motivated to change. So, then we are one step ahead, because they will try to make these changes applicable at their workplace, but there in it will be becoming the future step. But at present, at the end of the training program, if they feel motivated and they say yes, we want to apply whatever we have learned in this training program, we will go back to our workplace, and when we will implement, then in that case definitely that will be the more and more successful program. So, therefore, what the trainees have changed as a result of participating in the training program, it assesses the knowledge, skill, attitude, behavior change in the knowledge, skill, knowledge level. There are 5 levels: knowledge level 1, knowledge level 2, knowledge level 3, knowledge level 4, knowledge level 5. So, therefore, in that case, have they reached to the knowledge level 5? The skills, what skills were required to deliver the task, have they adopted those skills? Their attitudes, that is there a positive attitude or not? Is there has been the change in behavior or not? Or some other outcomes acquired by the trainees. So, therefore, for example, a particular understanding, a particular vision, and then if there has been change and they are now more positive and more towards the organizational goals, then definitely it will be a measurement of this will be more helpful in evaluation of a training program. Summative evaluation usually involves the collecting the quantitative numerical data, as I mentioned, that is the while if you see that in case of this formative evaluation, in formative evaluation it was the qualitative in nature, while in case of the summative evaluation it is the quantitative numerical data is there, and through test. So, we conduct the test and we try to see whether they have been properly understood or not. So, many organizations what they do, they take the test before the training program, then training program is conducted and the test will be taken after the training program. So, therefore, in that case, that whether they through this test is there any change in the learning and understanding of the trainees or not. Our ratings of behavior, for example, a trainee is a highly complaining attitude. If it is a highly complaining attitude, we will identify whether the person is able to getting that particular complaining attitude low or not. Now, he is more positive, he tries to understand others' problems also, and then we will say the ratings of behavior are there. Or objective measures of performance such as volume of sales. So, it was the training program on sales. After the training program, whether the sales have been increased or not, accidents or the patents. So, therefore, in that case whether there is a reduction in the accidents or not. So, therefore, it was suppose the program was on safety, industrial safety, then we have to see whether the program that has been helpful to reduce the accidents or not, and there are the more safety measures are there. Or the patents, and therefore, in that case whether the more patents have been registered in that particular area. Suppose the program was on creativity, innovation, how to apply the patent and how to make the patent search. If this was the objective, then we will go with this particular the patents are there. So, this is the evaluation process which one can follow. This the source is based on the DA GRU and the C out stuff program evaluation in developing human resources, right. So, they have the full reference is given here and from the book of the human resource management, and then I will explain the each step one by one. So, to make the more efficient and effective training program, it should not be that is the one fine morning the trainer announces a one training program without understanding whether there is a need or there is no need. Like many organizations nowadays, they are asking to conduct a training program on employee engagement. Many organizations they are asking to conduct the training program on the OCB, organizational citizenship behavior, so that they can conduct and they can behave as per the fundamental rights and fundamental duties of the organization. So, what an organization need? Organization may need increase in sales, maybe need in the change in attitude and behavior, may want to develop the leadership qualities, may have succession planning, may go for the employee engagement, may go for the happiness index creation at the workplace, may be developing the optimism amongst the employees. So, therefore, in that case they conduct a need analysis and identify that is the what is the need of the employees. So, as I mentioned earlier, that there can be these performance appraisals and potential appraisal systems that can be used for the purpose of identifying the need analysis. Then the developing the measurable learning objectives and analyze the transfer of training. So, therefore, in that case in evaluation the training program is conducted and now we can measure the learning objectives with the help of test and this or that through the participation, through the judgments, and then analyze the transfer of training, whether the training has been transferred or has not been transferred. Develop the outcome measures. Now, suppose the results are there and then suppose it is summative and therefore, it is a quantitative. So, you know what percentage you have achieved, and if we have achieved the less percentage, then definitely we have to first develop the outcome measures, because there will be certain qualitative, certain quantitative, and then there has to be for the trainer, trainee and training. So, evaluation should have the three components, and all these three components that the outcomes has to be measured. Choose an evaluation strategy, maybe the quantitative, maybe qualitative. However, I will suggest to go by both, not only by the formative, right, not only by summative, rather than by both, and plan and execute the evaluation, and then on basis of that you are supposed to evaluate the training program. Now, what are the outcomes used in the evaluation of training program? To evaluate its training program, a company must decide how it will determine the program's effectiveness, right. So, that should be in the mind. What we want from the, what we understand, organization understands by the effectiveness. The effectiveness is, as I mentioned, that is the, if it is a behavioral change, then it will be slowly change in the behavior, but there will be certain personalities and therefore, it will be difficult for to change them. So, therefore, what will be the measurement? Measurement will be the like 90% people will change who have attended the training program. That is, it must identify what training outcomes or criteria it will be measured. So, it will be behavioral or it will be non-behavioral. So, those aspects are to be changed. Now, here I would like to share with you the Kirkpatrick's the 4-level framework of evaluation criteria. What it talks about? It talks about the reaction, the learning, the behavior and the results are there. So, therefore, reaction, how to measure the reactions? Measure your participants' initial reaction to gain us understanding of the training. So, therefore, whenever they join the training program, the training starts, and then in the beginning of the phase itself, phase 1, you can identify whether the what is the reaction of the trainees, they are able to learn or they are not able to learn, and valuable insights into material quality, educator and more. So, how they judge? They judge into the material quality, the study material which has been given to them, they judge on basis of that and they will give the reaction on that. Second is on the educator, who is the trainer and what training program he has conducted. So, therefore, their reaction will be on this particular educator, and there will be further training program itself. So, therefore, your study material, material quality, the trainer, who is a trainer and how the training is conducted, for that they will give their reaction. So, reaction is to be measured. So, reaction is a one dimension, a parameter which is to be measured. Second is learning is to be measured. When we are talking about the evaluation, we have to measure the learning. How? Measure how much information was effectively absorbed. Test, conduct the test. When you conduct this test, and that is why we keep on examination. Examination method is nothing but it is a test that whatever has been taught, whether there has been transferred or it has not been transferred, and then how much it has been transferred, was effectively absorbed during the training, and map it to the program or individual learning objectives. And therefore, every individual has joined, a trainee has joined with a particular objective, and that particular objective that has been measured or not, that has to be checked. So, that it is about the learning process, that is there the learning, properly learning is done during the training program or not. Behavior, measure how much training has influenced the behavior of the participants and evaluate how they apply this information on the job. Now, see, it is very difficult to change the behavior, because I have discussed in the time of personality, when I have discussed, that is, the personality is based on the heredity, environment and situation, and because of that heredity, environment and situation, it becomes very difficult for somebody, that is the to change his behavior. But is it possible? Yes, it is possible, but only thing is a continuous efforts are to be made for making the change in the behavior. So, you have to measure how much your training has influenced the behavior of the participants and evaluating how they apply this information on the job. And then yes, if there is a change in behavior when they go to the workplace, now what happens? That is the work culture and employees behavior, that relationship is very, very important. So, if the leader, he allows a particular behavior, it means that this is the work culture which will flow from top to bottom. So, if there is any negative behavior, immediately it has to be checked by the trainer, by the superiors of the organizations, and therefore, in that case, because the change in behavior is not that easy, because it is a long time habit. It is an old habit, and a old habit dies hard. So, therefore, in that case it becomes very important, that is the whether there will be change in behavior or not, and how much time it requires to change in behavior. Then evaluation of results, measure and analyze the impact your training has had at the business level. So, therefore, naturally we have to find out, that is the whatever training program is conducted, it is having at the business level or not, and be sure to tie it to the individual or program. So, results are whatever results are there. So, why it is? Because maybe because of the individuals or maybe because of the program, and therefore, in that case your results are showing a particular outcome. So, according to Kirkpatrick's 4-level framework of evaluation criteria, you will find these are the 4 parameters which are to be evaluated. One is the reaction, what is the outcome of the trainees, learning, whether the trainees have learned or they have not learned. Third dimension is the behavior, is there change in behavior or there is no change in behavior, and then we will find out the results. Results are the satisfactory or not satisfactory, that we will measure. So, this is about the perception, determine the degree to which Trainees are familiar with the principles, facts, techniques, procedures or processes emphasized in the training program. Skill based outcomes are very important, that is whatever learning of the skills, if that was a technical training, then definitely the skills, whether they are able to learn those skills and are they are able to use of the skills on the job or not. Then affective outcome include attitudes and motivation. It includes tolerance for diversity, motivation to learn, safety attitudes, whether they are able to. Now the safety training has been given. So you want to reduce the accidents. So the workers, they should be ready to accept the safety appliances. Now what happens, like for example, we see there is on the bike riders the safety is through helmet, but many times they find difficult to have that practice of wearing helmet. Now that there will be training programs, there will be awareness camp, and through this they will try, that is there is the enough motivation to bear the helmet. Similarly, this is the attitude and motivation, and that will be the affective outcome, and if there is affective outcome, then it includes the tolerance for diversity. Whatever the tolerance for diversity is there, then that has to be there. Motivation to learn, as I mentioned, that is the always keen to learn, willingness to learn, and then the customer service orientation is there, so to serve the customers. So finally, what I would like to say, this Kirkpatrick's 4-level framework of evaluation criteria, it talks about the results are used to determine the training program's payoff for the company. Now what should be the payoff for the company? So that will be the ROI. ROI about the reactions, learning, behavior and results. So 4 points are very important, and therefore whatever the training program is conducted, so that they have to observe, they have to evaluate the reaction of the trainees, participants, what is their reaction, and that reaction, as I mentioned, that may be related to the study material, that may be related to the trainer, that may be related to the venue, that may be related to the overall organizational performance. So therefore in that case, these results are becoming very important. It includes the increased production and reduced cost. So why should we go for the training program evaluation by these methods? Because that will be increase the production and reducing the cost. Now you can also find out, that is what training programs are to be conducted and what training programs are not needed, on the basis of the demand, on the basis of the need of the trainees, and therefore you can produce those training programs, or you can save the cost on basis of not producing that particular training program. If you can produce the training programs and there is a response for the training program, then definitely there is a satisfactory ROI, return on investment. So when we talk about, that is we have to see that there is an increase in production after the training program. Yes, that is a skill which have been adopted by these particular employees. They are very efficient, effective, useful, and have been learned by the trainees, and therefore you will find, that is they will go through the cost reduction to the employees turnover. And naturally, when employees feeling a comfort zone at workplace, whenever they are talking about doing the job with the ease of job, ease of environment is created at the workplace, then definitely what their willingness to work in the same organization for a long time, that will continue. And whenever we are making the investment in the training, what we want? We want, that is they should be able to come out with that particular output, that is they will give the more efficiency and more effectiveness at their workplace, and they will be continuing in the organization for the long period of time. So it will result into the product increase, not only in the increase the production and reduce the cost, but it will be also affect the employees turnover, and employees turnover will be low because of the ease at workplace. And because of this ease, and then the understanding and learning, there will be the less accidents, and whatever the breakdown time was there, then breakdown time will be less, and therefore more efficiency and more effectiveness will be there, and which we can measure, and we can identify that is the yes, because of the training there is the more efficiency, better effectiveness is there. So, as well as improvements in product quality. So, not only in the terms of the quantity, this will be also measured in the terms of the product quality. So, product quality is also increasing, and so as a result the customer service is also increasing. So, therefore, whenever we talk about the evaluation of training program has to be done, as I talked about in the need and importance is there. We have to follow the Kirk's model, and in which we talk about that is the what is the reaction is there, that is to be measured and evaluated, what are the learnings are there, is there any change in learning is there or not, that is to be learning and that is to be tested, evaluated. Then there will be has to be change in the behavior, there is the behavior is change or not, and is their approach, their attitude, their understanding, and that has been changed or not. And finally, the results, that is the whether the results are giving the payoff that particular training program or not, that we have to see. And as a result of which we will find that is this Kirkpatrick's 4-level framework of evaluation criteria helps us to evaluate the training program more efficiently and effectively. Thank you.